He was beaten behind closed doors, just another forgotten dog in the camp, silent and trembling. But what they didn't know was he was a hero. When the truth came out, it didn't just bring justice, it changed the law. This isn't just a story of rescue. It's a story of redemption, of a forgotten soldier finding his voice again, and making the world listen. Before we go any further, how was your day? Leave a quick comment and let me know. You matter here. And if you believe that dogs can sense what we can't, if you believe in invisible heroes wrapped in golden fur, hit that subscribe button for more stories. Thank you so much. The winter morning in Asheville, North Carolina had that brittle cold that crept through gloves and settled deep in the bones. Frost still clung to the chain-link fences outside the Asheville County Animal Rehabilitation Shelter, and a pale sun tried to pierce the cloudy sky. Inside, fluorescent lights flickered faintly above a maze of kennels, echoing with low growls, whimpers, and the occasional hopeful bark. Among these forgotten voices was a German shepherd named Ranger, his presence barely acknowledged by the exhausted staff. Ranger was 4 years old with a strong, muscular frame now hidden under a coat matted by neglect and shadowed with faint scars. His fur, once a proud blend of black saddle and golden tan, had dulled with grime. His amber eyes, once known for their focus and calm during K9 training exercises, now flickered with confusion and fear. Ever since he had been brought in 3 days ago as a nameless stray found near a highway, he had remained curled in the back corner of his kennel, flinching at every passing footstep. Across the facility, Brian Tucker entered the shelter break room late. He was in his late 20s, with a broad build, unkempt blonde hair, and a permanent scowl that made people keep conversations short. A former warehouse worker recently hired due to staff shortages, Brian had no prior experience with animals and even less patience. His blunt, transactional way of speaking and short temper made him the kind of man who believed authority came with volume. He resented being assigned to the back kennels, often grumbling about the aggressive dogs. Today, he had been tasked with cleaning Kennel 47, Ranger's space. Still nursing a hangover from the night before, he grumbled about how unfair it was that he had to deal with the ungrateful mutts alone again. The dog wing was quiet except for the low thump of tails and shuffles of paws. As Brian approached Ranger's kennel, the German shepherd visibly shrank into the corner. "Come on, you lazy mutt," Brian muttered. He unlocked the gate, stepping inside with a mop in one hand and a trash bag in the other. Ranger didn't move. His eyes were wide, fixed on Brian's raised arm. "Move!" Brian snapped. Still, Ranger didn't budge. His body was tense, breathing shallow. When Brian leaned in and reached for the dog's collar, something inside Ranger crumpled. He pressed himself even tighter against the cold concrete wall. That's when it happened. Brian, anger flaring, raised his hand and struck Ranger across the muzzle. "I said move," he shouted. Ranger yelped, not in pain but from the kind of fear that came from memory. He trembled violently, tail tucked under, ears flat against his head. Brian muttered under his breath and quickly finished cleaning the kennel. In his haste and irritation, he forgot to latch the gate securely as he left. What he didn't know was that above his head, a small security camera blinked silently, having recorded every second. At that same moment, a black sedan pulled into the staff lot. Stepping out was Avery James, bundled in a wool coat over faded jeans and hiking boots. She was 24, with auburn hair tied into a loose bun and kind eyes that always seemed slightly tired, a side effect of too many late-night study sessions. Avery was in her final year of veterinary school, and this was her first day of volunteer hours at Asheville County Shelter. She had always felt a quiet empathy for animals, likely rooted in the childhood memory of losing her family's golden retriever to neglect at a distant shelter. That grief had shaped her. She was patient, observant, and more comfortable around animals than people. Inside, Avery was greeted by a middle-aged woman with short-cropped hair and a clipboard, Marla Hendricks, the facility's senior volunteer coordinator. Marla had a brisk manner, the kind that came from 2 decades of seeing the worst and best of animal rescue. She handed Avery a visitor's badge. "You're assigned to Zone C." Back kennels. Mostly difficult cases. Be cautious. If you see a red tag, don't enter without staff. Avery nodded, clutching the clipboard handed to her. As she passed rows of barking and pacing dogs, something inside her tightened. These weren't just strays. They were survivors. When she reached Kennel 47, she found it oddly quiet. The gate was shut but slightly ajar. She leaned closer. No dog visible. Confused, she slowly opened it and peeked inside. Nothing. Her brows furrowed. The intake sheet clipped to the door read, "Unnamed. Male. German Shepherd. Approximate, for years old. Extreme fear response. No chip." She remembered this one. Last night, she had read an article about a missing police dog named Shadow, last seen during a training session near the Blue Ridge Parkway. The dog had vanished without a trace. There had been whispers online about whether someone had taken him, but there was no way to know. Still puzzled, Avery continued her rounds, not realizing the very dog from that story was just a few feet away, trembling behind a stack of blankets in the janitorial closet. There, Ranger waited, silent, terrified, and unnoticed. And so the day continued, the camera's footage still untouched, the pain still hidden in the shadows. But everything was about to change. The Asheville shelter had settled into a midday lull, with most of the dogs exhausted from their morning barking fits, and the staff either on break or swamped with paperwork. Outside, sleet tapped rhythmically on the tin roof, a soft percussion that blurred time and dulled awareness. Deep in the facility, beyond the rows of steel-barred kennels and stacked crates of supplies, a silent figure moved through the corridor, a ghost among ghosts. Ranger's paws made no sound on the concrete floor, his body low, his ears angled back, each muscle locked in controlled tension. He had waited nearly 15 minutes after Brian Tucker stormed off, sensing that the man was truly gone. The kennel door, left partially ajar, had offered a sliver of freedom too tempting to ignore. Guided by instinct and fear, Ranger slipped into the hallway and vanished into a nearby janitorial room. The room smelled faintly of ammonia and old towels. Along the wall sat a tall metal shelf stacked with folded fleece blankets, worn leashes, and unopened cleaning supplies. Behind that shelf, in the narrow space between wall and steel, he curled into the smallest shape his battered body would allow. There, in silence and shadow, he trembled. A few doors away, Avery James was finishing her second round through Zone C. Her boots clicked softly on the wet floor, clipboard under one arm, a bag of dog-safe treats tucked into her coat pocket. The early nerves from her first morning had subsided, replaced by curiosity and a gnawing sense that something didn't quite add up about the German Shepherd that was supposed to be in Kennel 47. She double-checked the log. No transfer. No notation. Just an empty space and a missing dog with an extreme fear tag. Her concern led her to the admin wing, where she knocked gently on a glass office door marked Shelter Manager. Inside sat Mark Sullivan, a tall, barrel-chested man in his mid-50s, with a short salt and pepper beard and shoulders that still carried the memory of his former life as a Marine. His demeanor was serious but not unkind. Years of working under city budgets and public scrutiny had taught him restraint, and though he rarely smiled, he listened more than most. He looked up from his laptop, expression unreadable. "Yes. I think one of the dogs in Zone C is missing. Kennel 47. German Shepherd," Avery said, stepping inside. Mark set down his coffee mug, frowning. "Did you check with intake or the med wing?" "I did. There's no record of him being moved. And the door to the kennel was ajar when I got there. No one saw him leave." Mark stood. "Show me." Back in Zone C, they searched every kennel, peered behind crates, checked the med wing, and even the small outdoor enclosure, all empty. The shelter wasn't enormous, but with its multiple storage rooms, it held far more corners than most newcomers realized. After 30 minutes of fruitless searching, Mark was visibly frustrated. "If he got outside," he began, running a hand through his beard. "He didn't," Avery said softly. "He's terrified. He wouldn't run. He'd hide." Mark raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. Instead, he gestured for her to lead the search. Avery walked the hall slowly, eyes scanning for shadows. It wasn't until she passed the janitorial room a second time that something clicked. The door was closed but not locked, and a thin trail of loose fur dusted the floor beneath it. She placed her hand on the knob, paused, then opened it gently. At first, she saw nothing but brooms, mops, and supplies. But then, behind the shelving, a pair of amber eyes caught the flickering light. "There you are," she breathed. Ranger didn't move, didn't blink. He was silent, curled tight, pressed so far into the corner it seemed he wanted to melt into the wall. Avery didn't move closer. Instead, she lowered herself slowly to the floor, crossing her legs and resting her back against the opposite wall. Her voice, when she spoke again, was low and steady. "You're all right, boy. You're safe here." Mark, watching from the doorway, opened his mouth to speak, but she held up a quiet hand. Then, reaching into her coat, she retrieved a small paperback from her pocket, something she had taken to carrying since her clinicals had begun. It was a worn copy of Watership Down, a childhood favorite, the kind of story that mirrored survival in uncertain worlds. She opened to a bookmarked page and began reading aloud, her voice just above a whisper. Ranger didn't move for a long time. But slowly, the violent tremor in his body began to soften. Every few minutes, he glanced at Avery, then looked away. His ears twitched at her cadence, her tone, not demanding or intrusive, but calm like distant rainfall. Mark leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. He was a pragmatic man. He had seen volunteers panic, cry, or become overwhelmed on their first day. But this was different. This was control, not over the animal, but over herself. She hadn't forced contact. She didn't even try to coax him out. She simply gave him time. After 20 minutes, Ranger lifted his head. His front paw inched forward. Then, as if realizing he had moved too much, he froze again. Avery didn't acknowledge it. She kept reading. Mark finally stepped forward. "Why didn't you call for backup when you found him?" She looked up. "Because he's not ready. And calling in others right away would have scared him deeper. I thought he deserved a chance to come forward, not be dragged back." Mark was silent for a beat. Then, after a long breath, he nodded. "You've worked with trauma cases before?" "Only in school," she admitted. "But I had a dog once. He disappeared when I was 12. We never found him. If someone had been gentler, maybe he'd have stayed." He looked at her for a long moment, then back at the German shepherd in the shadows. "He trusts you. That's rare." Before he left the room, he added, "Stay with him as long as you need. I'll make sure no one interrupts." As the door clicked softly behind him, Avery closed her book and placed it on the floor between them. Her eyes met Ranger's. "Whenever you're ready," she said. And this time, Ranger didn't look away. The following morning, the frost had thickened over Asheville like a delicate crust of salt, turning rooftops white and sidewalks slick with crystalline ice. Inside the shelter, heaters hummed faintly against the metal and concrete, failing to bring real warmth to the building's bones. In the quiet of the early hours, before most of the staff had clocked in, Avery returned to the janitorial room. Ranger was still there, alert now, head raised, ears twitching at the sound of her boots. She didn't speak at first. She simply lowered herself to the floor again, cross-legged like before. This time, she brought boiled chicken wrapped in wax paper and set it gently in the middle of the floor. Ranger didn't move immediately, but his nose twitched. After 10 minutes, his paw stretched forward cautiously, pulling the treat toward him. Avery watched without comment. Trust was being formed, not forced. Later that morning, she met with Gloria Benson, the former shelter director who had stepped down 6 months earlier after a stroke, but still volunteered twice a week. Gloria was in her late 60s, with sharp gray eyes, a cane with a carved owl handle, and a voice that balanced wisdom with steel. She wore a long wool cardigan over slacks and orthopedic shoes, her gait slow but purposeful. There was an edge to her personality, one formed from decades of dealing with city bureaucracy, difficult cases, and more than once, the betrayal of her own staff. "Mark told me you found something odd about a shepherd," Gloria said, motioning for Avery to follow her into the intake office. "Yes. Kennel 47. They've labeled him as a stray with no chip, but he doesn't act like a stray. He's trained, not just house-trained, but tactical. His reactions are measured, controlled. Gloria opened the database on the aging computer and navigated through a few menus with practiced precision. "Let's pull up his intake photos," she muttered. The screen flickered, revealing a series of shots. The shepherd curled up in the corner of his kennel, flinching from the camera, his fur dirty but familiar. Avery leaned in. "That's him. That's Ranger." Gloria zoomed in slowly, examining the markings around the eyes and muzzle. Her brow furrowed. "These aren't random. Look, this is symmetrical. And this scar on his right flank, see that?" Avery narrowed her eyes. There, half hidden beneath layers of grime, was a small raised scar. It was precise, almost surgical. Gloria straightened. "I've seen that before. Hold on." She hobbled toward a file cabinet and pulled out a thick accordion folder labeled Special Cases. From it, she extracted a manila envelope. Inside were printouts of missing working dogs from regional police departments, part of an older coordination effort Gloria had helped establish before she retired. She laid out the pages on the table, her hands shaking slightly from the cold and age. "There," she said, tapping one. "That's Shadow. K-9 assigned to Officer Cole Bennett. Disappeared 7 weeks ago during a narcotics training drill in Pisgah National Forest. They never found him." The image showed a younger, stronger version of Ranger. Same black saddle, same tan legs, same intelligent amber eyes. But what confirmed it was the scar, nearly identical, noted in the file. Microchip removal site suspected. Avery sat back. "That's him." Gloria nodded slowly. "And if he's here?" Someone wanted him to disappear. The room went quiet for a moment, heavy with implication. "Shadow was one of the sharpest K-9s in the region," Gloria said finally. "Helped break a meth ring 2 years ago. That case was personal. He tracked the suspect through freezing terrain for 8 hours straight. Found a hidden stash that even our human agents missed." She rubbed her temple, the memory casting a shadow over her weathered face. "We all thought someone would have taken him for ransom, or worse. But bringing him here? Registering him as a stray without a chip? That means someone inside knew how to manipulate the intake system." Avery's thoughts raced. "I don't think he was brought in properly. His gate was left open the other day. He wasn't logged into the daily health check, either. It's like someone dropped him in and vanished." Gloria's expression hardened. "That's not just sloppy. That's intentional." From the doorway, a new voice entered. Did someone say intentional? It was Dr. Renee Foster, the shelter's consulting veterinarian. In her mid-40s with dark skin, a tight bun, and small wire-rimmed glasses, Dr. Foster had the efficient manner of someone who'd seen too many corners cut and wasn't afraid to call it out. Her lab coat was always pristine, and she carried a tablet that rarely left her side. Gloria filled her in quickly. Foster knelt beside the intake photo, then glanced at the folder. "I gave that dog a surface exam when he came in. He flinched, but he let me get close. I didn't feel a microchip, which was odd, but I didn't press. Let me look at that scar myself." The 3 women returned to the janitorial room. Ranger was still curled behind the shelving, but when Avery entered, he raised his head, visibly calmer. Dr. Foster knelt carefully on the other side. "Hey boy, just need a look," she murmured. She wore latex gloves and moved slowly, avoiding direct eye contact. As she parted the fur on his right flank, her breath caught. A thin scar ran just below the skin. "Clean. Intentional. That's a surgical incision," she confirmed. "Someone removed his chip." Avery swallowed. "That means someone knew exactly who he was. And they didn't want him found." Gloria stood silent, leaning on her cane, watching Ranger's eyes. Then the question becomes, how did he get from Pisgah Forest to a stray intake without alerting anyone? And none of them had an answer. The afternoon light filtered weakly through the high windows of the Asheville County Animal Rehabilitation Shelter, casting long bars of gold and dust across the concrete floor. The icy breath of winter still clung to the glass, but inside, there was a growing current of urgency in the air. Avery sat at the volunteer desk, fingers tapping lightly on her clipboard, eyes flicking to the hallway every few seconds. Gloria had made the call earlier that morning, her voice taut with something between hope and unease. Now they were waiting. Outside, a patrol SUV pulled into the shelter's parking lot, its lights off but the insignia of the Buncombe County Sheriff's Department clearly visible on the side. The door opened, and a tall man stepped out. Deputy Cole Bennett moved with the kind of controlled energy that came from years in law enforcement, broad-shouldered and clean-shaven, with dark blonde hair clipped short, and a jaw that looked like it had never learned how to smile easily. He was in his early 40s, dressed in a green sheriff's jacket and dark jeans, his eyes scanning the building with precision born of habit. Cole had been a K-9 handler for over a decade, known for his quiet confidence and his strict but fair training methods. But those who knew him best also knew he hadn't been quite the same since Shadow disappeared. It had happened during a routine field training in Pisgah National Forest. A sudden snap of leash, the barking, the radio silence. They had searched for days. Some assumed a wild animal attack. Others whispered darker possibilities. Cole never accepted any of it. He just kept looking. Inside, Avery stood when he entered. "Deputy Bennett?" He nodded, his voice low. "Call me Cole. You're Avery?" "Yes. Follow me." As she led him through the corridor, Cole walked with tight shoulders and a steady, coiled pace. They passed barking dogs, but his attention didn't stray. When they neared the janitorial room, Avery slowed. "He's been hiding back here since he got out of his kennel. We didn't want to move him too fast." Cole didn't respond. He stepped into the room, his boots echoing against the floor. Behind the shelving unit, where folded blankets and buckets formed an accidental cave, a pair of amber eyes stared back. "Shadow," Cole said, softly but firmly, a tremor riding the edge of the name. For a moment, there was stillness. Then Ranger moved. He uncoiled like a spring, his paws sliding slightly on the tile, and bounded forward, not in aggression but in recognition. He pressed his body hard against Cole's legs, letting out a series of short, urgent whines. Cole dropped to one knee and wrapped both arms around him, burying his face in the fur just below the shepherd's ears. "Where've you been, buddy?" he whispered, voice breaking. Avery and Gloria stood silently in the doorway, watching as the dog who had flinched at every sound now trembled in joy. It was unmistakable. Whatever name had been scribbled on intake forms, this was no stray. This was Shadow, and he had come home. After several minutes, Cole stood, his hand still resting on Shadow's neck. "He's lost weight. A lot. And this coat, he's been somewhere filthy. Confined." "We thought the same," Avery said. "There's a scar where his chip used to be. We believe it was surgically removed." Cole's jaw tightened. Someone tried to erase him. "Worse," Gloria added. "They brought him here to hide in plain sight." Dr. Renee Foster arrived moments later, still in her lab coat, tablet in hand. She'd received Gloria's request and brought along swabs and gloves. "Let me get a closer look now that he's calm." Shadow, still leaning against Cole, allowed her to approach. Renee moved with practiced calm, her fingers parting the fur around the scar, checking his ears, eyes, and coat. When she reached his underbelly and sides, she paused. "There's something else," she said. "Do you see this residue?" She lifted a clump of fur near the back leg, revealing a faint yellowish powder crusted along the roots. Cole's brow furrowed. "What is it?" "I don't know yet. I'll run a panel. But I've seen similar chemical traces before in seizure cases tied to methamphetamine production. This may not just be a dog theft." Renee's tone was clinical, but her eyes were sharp behind her glasses. "If Shadow was kept near or in a production site, this isn't just a cruelty case. It's connected to something much bigger." Cole exhaled slowly, the puzzle pieces starting to move in his mind. "They took a trained K-9 and removed his ID. That's not random. That's a threat." Avery leaned against the wall, trying to absorb the implications. But why bring him here? Why risk registering him if they were trying to hide him? "Because," Gloria said, "the shelter's the last place anyone would expect to find a trained police dog. If someone inside was involved, someone who knew how to manipulate records, It's the perfect cover. Cole's eyes met hers. And that means they're still watching. They moved Shadow to a private room, one used for recovering trauma cases, clean, carpeted, and removed from the noisy kennel rows. Cole stayed with him, sitting on the floor as Shadow curled up beside him, eyes finally closing in rest. He hadn't slept like that in weeks. Later, in the staff break room, Renee returned with a test strip and a small vial. "It's positive," she said. "Not just trace chemicals. It's a reagent match for synthetic compound residues used in designer stimulants. Not meth exactly, but something newer." Gloria looked toward Avery. "We need to contact state authorities." Cole shook his head. "Not yet. Let me run it through a friend in narcotics first. Quietly. If there's someone dirty in this chain, we go wide too fast and they'll burn everything. Then we move carefully," Renee said. "But make no mistake, someone brought Shadow here because they were getting desperate." That night, as the shelter dimmed its lights and the dogs settled into uneasy sleep, Shadow lay curled at Cole's feet, breathing steady. Whatever darkness had taken him, whatever hands had tried to erase his past, it hadn't succeeded. And now the past was knocking back. The next morning broke with an eerie stillness over Asheville. The sky was overcast with slate-gray clouds clinging low to the Blue Ridge Mountains. A sharp wind moved through the bare trees, rattling brittle branches like bones, and the streets were slick with frozen dew. At the shelter, there was a strange quiet too, one that didn't come from rest, but anticipation. Deputy Cole Bennett stood in the converted trauma recovery room, where Shadow now rested on a thick foam mat. The shepherd lay with his head resting on his paws, ears occasionally twitching at distant sounds. Cole had hardly slept. He'd sat on the floor beside Shadow for most of the night, staring at the scar on the dog's side like it might whisper a clue. There was a tension deep in his chest, and it was more than just fury. It was the weight of connection, of having something stolen and returned in pieces. He stood and reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small leather notebook, its cover faded and creased. Inside were pages of past cases, training notes, scent logs, deployment entries. Cole flipped to a page dated 15 months ago, December 18th industrial storage raid. He tapped the page and whispered, "You remember this, buddy?" Shadow's ears perked up. Behind them, the door creaked. Avery stepped in, holding her pharmacology textbook to her chest. She wore a navy hoodie under her shelter vest and had her auburn hair braided down one side. Her eyes were soft but alert. "I brought something," she said, walking slowly toward them. "We're covering synthetic stimulant compounds this week. I thought maybe it would help." Cole nodded, intrigued. Avery set the book on the ground, flipping to a page filled with chemical diagrams and descriptions. She gently slid a printed note card from the pages, one that had traces of lab-pressed powder on it from her study set, and held it out. Shadow sniffed the air, then stood abruptly. His body tensed, nostrils flaring. A soft growl rumbled low in his throat. "That's the posture," Cole muttered. "That's his narcotics signal." "You found something." Avery's brow furrowed. "This is just a learning sample from class. But if he recognizes it, it means he's been near something very similar recently. Or trained on it before." Cole crouched, placing his hand on Shadow's shoulder. "Good boy. Dr. Renee Foster entered moments later, carrying a sealed evidence bag with soil and debris taken from Shadows for the day before. Her dark eyes focused immediately on the interaction. "We just finished the first round of lab analysis," she said, raising the bag. "There are trace minerals in this dirt that match soil types from a very narrow area north of Asheville, specifically near the old steelworks by French Broad River. There are also fragments of what looks like red clay mixed with charcoal dust. That combo is pretty unique to the old mill property." Avery nodded. "That place has been closed for decades." Renee added, "But not exactly empty. There's been talk of illegal squatters and undocumented shipments moving through the back lots." Cole stood fully now, his voice steeled. "That's the same quadrant where we lost signal on Shadow's collar before he disappeared. It never made sense. No terrain blockage. No cliffs. Just static. Maybe it wasn't a loss of signal, Avery said softly. Maybe someone jammed it. In the corner, Shadow remained still, but his eyes were locked on Cole's face. He was listening. Meanwhile, in the back office of the shelter, Gloria Benson had dug into something else entirely. The former director had spent the last 2 hours in the archive room, a cluttered, dusty storage closet filled with external hard drives, unlabeled DVDs, and out-of-date tech. Her fingers were red from cold, but her mind was razor sharp. She finally found what she was looking for, a drive labeled Security Footage November/December Archives. Plugging it into the main admin computer, Gloria scrubbed through timestamps until something caught her eye. A file dated 3 weeks prior, timestamped 9:42 p.m., well after hours. The shelter was dark, but a motion-activated camera near the intake bay flicked on. The grainy footage showed Brian Tucker, the young temp staffer, pulling up in a battered pickup truck. In the bed of the truck was a crate. He parked outside the secondary entrance, checked his surroundings, and wheeled the crate inside. There was no one else on camera. No paperwork filed. No intake entry. Gloria leaned closer as Brian opened the crate. The dog that stepped out was covered in grime, trembling, and visibly disoriented, but unmistakably Ranger. Or rather, Shadow. Gloria's jaw clenched. She pressed pause and took a screenshot, printing it out along with the log metadata. She moved quickly toward the trauma recovery room and knocked once before entering. "I think I found how he got here." She held up the printout. Brian brought him in after hours. No intake records. No witnesses. He didn't scan him for a chip because he knew there wasn't one. Cole took the paper, reading the timestamp. "This lines up with the same night we picked up chatter from one of our informants about a new shipment moving through town. Narcotics uncut. No origin. Shadow must have been dumped here after the operation went sideways." "And Brian?" Avery asked. "Not smart enough to be the mastermind," Gloria said, "but definitely involved." Renee crossed her arms. "We need to contact the FBI. If a known K9 went missing during an active case and turned up here with traces of drug compounds on his coat and tampered ID, this isn't just internal. This is federal." Cole nodded. "I'll make the call." As the day wore on, pieces began connecting like steel gears long dislodged but now grinding back into motion. Soil, scent, footage, and memory. And at the center of it all stood Shadow, no longer the trembling shell of a dog, but the trained partner, ready once more to lead the way. It began not with sirens but silence. In the early hours before sunrise, Asheville was cloaked in a heavy, moonless darkness, the kind that blurred outlines and swallowed sound. At 4:12 a.m., marked only by the soft crunch of boots on gravel and the muffled hum of radios, federal agents and local police teams moved like shadows through the outskirts of town. Unmarked vans fanned out toward abandoned warehouses, rundown kennels, and backwoods properties flagged during the investigation into Shadow's disappearance. This was not just a dog rescue, it was the dismantling of something far more insidious. At the shelter, Cole Bennett stood beside Special Agent Marissa Talcott, the FBI liaison assigned after the case was escalated. Agent Talcott was a no-nonsense woman in her late 30s, with short auburn hair, piercing green eyes, and a methodical calm that often unsettled people more than shouting ever could. Dressed in tactical black with a badge clipped to her vest, she reviewed the printed blueprints of the raid zones while speaking into a headset. 3 confirmed holding sites, she said. "One's a front for illegal breeding, one's linked to chemical distribution, and the third matches the soil and residue found on Shadow." Cole adjusted the earpiece on his comms unit. "Any idea how long they've been running this?" "Long enough to change hands at least twice. But it looks like the new operators made mistakes." She nodded at Shadow, who sat at Cole's side, alert and waiting. "Thanks to him." Back at the shelter, Avery paced outside the main office, hands buried in the pockets of her oversized parka. The cold nipped at her cheeks, but her mind buzzed with worry and adrenaline. Inside, Gloria and Dr. Renee were watching the live feed streamed from body cams on the field teams. Avery glanced at her phone again. No new texts from Cole. No updates. She turned toward the volunteer board, just inside the staff hallway. Her name was still scribbled in dry erase ink under rotation, Zone C. But a sticky note fluttered near it, pinned with a red thumbtack. In Gloria's sharp handwriting it read, "See me. Promotion rec under review." Before she could process the words, a voice called from behind. It was Nathan Romero, one of the shelter's longtime volunteers. In his late 20s, Nathan had a warm, round face, brown skin, and a quiet, steady presence that calmed even the rowdiest animals. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and always smelled faintly of cedar and dog shampoo. "You okay?" he asked, setting down a bucket of supplies. "I don't know. I feel like something big's happening, and I'm just here." "You're not just anything," he said gently. "You're the reason Shadow's safe. That counts." Avery gave a small smile. "Thanks." Across town, the raids began. The first location was a seemingly defunct kennel operation near Barnardsville Road. When agents stormed the property, they found dozens of crates, some empty, some filled with malnourished dogs. Hidden beneath tarp-covered cages was a small, soundproofed shed that contained industrial vats, heating coils, and labeled chemical drums. It wasn't just a holding space. It was a full-scale lab. In one corner of the property, a false wall gave way to a hidden door. Behind it, 3 dogs, 2 Belgian Malinois and 1 German Shepherd, cowered in individual cages. Their coats were matted, but their posture was unmistakable, working dogs, trained and broken. One of them growled as agents approached until a handler spoke the universal code command, "Stand down." The dog froze, then whimpered. Back at the command center, Agent Talcott's voice came through. 3 recovered. 1 matching K9 ID from Harris County. Another from Tallahassee PD, 3rd unconfirmed. Cole's jaw clenched. "They're stealing and trading trained dogs. Or using them to train their own. That's how these guys stay ahead, take what works, twist it into what they need." Meanwhile, the second raid targeted a backwoods compound listed as a boarding facility. It was there they found Brian Tucker. He was attempting to leave in a rusted-out Dodge pickup, shirt half-buttoned, jaw clenched with desperation. When officers surrounded the vehicle, he tried to flee on foot, but was quickly tackled by 2 agents. His phone, seized at the scene, told a far uglier story. Inside were text chains with burner numbers, photos of Shadow during confinement, coded GPS drops, and detailed notes on drug supply movements. One folder was labeled Asset K9. Another, detagged. In the staff room, Agent Talcott handed the evidence to Cole. This was never about one dog. This was infrastructure, and someone inside your shelter helped enable it. Cole's gaze hardened, but he said nothing. Later that day, Avery was called into the main office. Gloria sat behind the desk, while Dr. Foster stood near the whiteboard. Both women wore serious expressions. "Avery," Gloria began, "we're restructuring operations after the FBI's findings. That includes volunteer training." Avery's eyes widened. "Your approach with Shadow, and the others, proved you can handle trauma-informed care. That's rare. We'd like to offer you the role of volunteer training coordinator." Dr. Foster added, "You'll be working closely with me on temperament assessments, rehabilitation integration, and onboarding new recruits." Avery blinked, speechless for a moment. I don't even have my degree yet." Gloria smiled, the first real smile in days. "You have something just as important. Instinct." Outside, Cole knelt beside Shadow near the fence line, both watching the wind blow frost across the yard. Shadow leaned slightly against his partner's leg, content, eyes scanning but no longer haunted. "They got Brian," Cole said aloud. Shadow didn't move, but Cole swore he understood. "We're not done," he added. "But we're not alone anymore." A week had passed since the raids, and Asheville had returned to its quiet winter rhythm, the streets brushed with frost, and the trees bare and brittle under a pale sun. But within the walls of the shelter, change pulsed like a heartbeat. The staff moved with renewed purpose, volunteers whispered with hope instead of dread, and dogs, once resigned to cages, barked again with energy, even if the sounds still carried notes of trauma. Shadow's recovery had become the emotional center of it all. The trauma recovery room had been repurposed for long-term rehabilitation, fitted with a soft rug, ambient lighting, and calming diffusers. Cole visited every morning, arriving in his civilian hoodie and jeans now that he was on temporary leave. His presence was steady and grounding. Shadow had begun to sleep through the night again, though certain noises, metal clanking, doors slamming, still caused him to flinch. Avery had become his second constant. Her quiet patience and intuitive empathy had earned Shadow's trust. She was now officially leading volunteer orientation and was beginning to design new trauma-informed modules with Dr. Foster. That morning, Avery arrived early with a sketchbook tucked under her arm. She had started illustrating the dogs as a way to decompress, sketching not just what they looked like, but how they felt, the guarded curl of their bodies, the shadows behind their eyes. Her drawing of Shadow, titled Still Watchful, had already been pinned to the break room wall by Gloria. As she stepped into the rehab room, Shadow lifted his head, tail thumping once against the mat. Cole was already there, seated cross-legged on the floor, rubbing the dog's ears absent-mindedly. "Hey," Avery said softly. He ate his full breakfast. Cole nodded. "First time since the raids." And he let me close the door without panicking. That's big. He's still nervous around tight spaces. But when I walked in and closed the door behind me this time, he stayed still. Watched. Waited. No shaking. That's progress. She knelt beside Shadow and gently offered her hand. He sniffed it, then nudged her palm. "You're doing so well," she whispered. At the back of the shelter, the construction crew finished mounting a new metal sign above the main gate. The old sign had read Asheville County Animal Shelter in rusted letters. The new one gleamed under the late morning sun, New Dawn Shelter, for healing and hope. The renaming had been unanimous. Gloria insisted it reflected not just what the shelter had become, but what it needed to continue being. The rest of the day was routine until just before lunch, when Nathan Romero called Avery from the main kennels. "Hey, can you come to Bay-D? I think we've got a shutdown case." She found Nathan crouched outside a corner enclosure, where a small tan dog lay curled up, unmoving. The pup was young, maybe 6 months old, with short fur, oversized ears, and visible ribs. His eyes were open but dull, his body pressed tightly into the back of the kennel, like he was trying to become invisible. "Name's Milo," Nathan murmured. "Picked up from an abuse case 3 days ago. Refuses food. Won't make eye contact. Foster said if we can't get him to stabilize, he'll need transfer to the trauma clinic in Raleigh." Avery crouched low and studied the pup. She recognized the signs, frozen fear, not disobedience. Milo wasn't rejecting care. He didn't believe he deserved it. "I have an idea," she said. "Let me bring someone." Back in the rehab room, she returned with Shadow on a short leash. He walked slowly beside her, head lowered, still alert but curious. As they approached Bay-D, Milo didn't react at first. But when Shadow stopped a few feet from the kennel and lay down quietly, something shifted. Shadow didn't bark, whine, or try to interact. He simply lay with his head resting on his front paws, facing Milo's enclosure. They stayed like that for almost 10 minutes. Then, in a motion so subtle Nathan almost missed it, Milo turned his head. His nose twitched once. Then again. By minute 20, Milo had UNC curled slightly, no longer pressed into the corner. By minute 30, he had crawled halfway forward and taken the piece of soft kibble Avery had placed just inside the wire. "It worked," Nathan whispered. "It wasn't me," Avery said. "He just needed to see someone who'd survived." Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the shelter slipped into its quiet lull, Cole stood beside the new sign. Shadow sat at his side, tail thumping once against the ground. "You're not just recovering," Cole said. "You're helping others recover too." In the reflection of the shelter's glass door, both man and dog stood tall, no longer haunted, but healing. The courtroom in downtown Asheville was a square box of pale wood and cold formality, with fluorescent lighting that hummed like tension. The gallery benches creaked under the weight of gathered press, local activists, and shelter volunteers. A guard stood near the doors, his eyes scanning the crowd, while court staff whispered across piles of documents. But the room's true center of gravity, despite the solemn judge or prosecuting attorneys, was a German shepherd lying calmly beside the witness stand. Shadow's black and tan coat had regained much of its original sheen, and his posture was steady, chest forward, head slightly lowered, ears alert. He wore a vest embroidered with white letters that read, Court Support Dog Witness Comfort and Trauma Response. It was a title no other dog in the state had ever held. Cole sat beside him, dressed in a suit he hadn't worn in years. He tugged slightly at the collar, more used to uniforms than lapels, but his face was composed. The kind of composure born from necessity, not calm but choice. Beside him, Shadow exhaled slowly and laid his head on his front paws. On the opposing side of the courtroom, Brian Tucker sat with a public defender at his elbow. His face was flushed and tight, his hair cut shorter than when he'd been arrested, his shoulders hunched as if shrinking into his own skin. He didn't look at Shadow. He hadn't all day. Judge Helen Martin presided from the bench, a tall woman in her early 60s with silver-streaked brown hair pulled into a low bun, her voice soft but surgical. Once a family law specialist, Judge Martin had a well-known bias for precision and a low tolerance for posturing. Her robe was plain, her expression unreadable. The prosecution began with the expected, images of the shelter's facilities, records of Brian's employment, inconsistencies in intake logs. Then came the footage. A grainy video from the shelter's overhead camera flickered onto the monitors. It showed Brian striking Ranger, Shadow, in the face. The yelp that followed filled the silent courtroom like a punch. Some gasped. Others averted their eyes. But Shadow did not move. Cole leaned slightly toward him, one hand resting on his back, but it was unnecessary. The dog remained still, not frozen but grounded, a living testament to both what he had suffered and what he had overcome. Dr. Renee Foster was next to testify. Her white blouse was crisp under her charcoal blazer, and she answered each question with clinical precision. She described the microchip scar, the chemical residues found in Shadow's fur, and the psychological behaviors consistent with prolonged confinement. She never raised her voice, never wavered. The removal of his chip, she said, was done surgically, deliberately. It was an attempt to erase identity, not treat injury. Then came Avery. She walked to the stand in a navy dress and black cardigan, her expression composed but her hands slightly trembling as she took the oath. Her auburn hair was pinned back, and she wore no makeup, just honesty and nervous determination. When the prosecutor asked how she first met Shadow, she described the janitor's closet. The blankets. The way she read aloud to the dog. Her voice softened as she recounted the slow progress, him creeping closer, his breath syncing with hers. And what was your role at the shelter at the time? Volunteer, she said. But now I oversee trauma recovery training and early intervention protocols. And that's why the State Animal Welfare Coalition reached out. Yes, Avery replied, clearing her throat. They've asked me to help design a training program that connects biological evidence, like trace residues or surgical scars, with trauma response to help shelters flag potential abuse cases early. There were murmurs in the gallery, impressed whispers. Even Judge Martin arched an eyebrow. After her testimony, she stepped down and returned to her seat beside Gloria and Nathan, who gave her a soft nod of pride. Gloria, dressed in her usual tweed blazer and slacks, had a small notepad in her lap, but hadn't written anything. She simply watched, like a commander watching her troops come into their own. When it was Cole's turn, the room settled deeper. He took the stand with quiet gravity, his deep voice resonant as he recounted Shadow's history, his training, his role in drug detection, the day he vanished. He would have been abandoned, Cole said, stripped of everything he was trained for, if it hadn't been for a volunteer who noticed something didn't add up. And what did you think when you saw him again? Cole paused, eyes flicking to Shadow lying below. I thought he survived. But more than that, he held on to who he was. That's what makes him valuable. Not his nose, not his training. His refusal to become what they wanted him to be. There was a stillness after he spoke. Then the judge cleared her throat and addressed the court. This case may be a first in our state. A working dog, stolen and erased, re-emerging to assist not in law enforcement, but in court. His presence here today is not only symbolic, it is transformative. Brian's sentence would not be handed down until later, but the room already felt like it had shifted. The weight of justice had found balance. Not revenge, restoration. That evening, as the courtroom emptied and press reporters flooded the sidewalk, Avery received a message from the coalition office in Raleigh. We'd like to offer you a fellowship. 1 year. Fully funded. Build the early warning model. Let's change the system. She stared at the message for a long moment before showing it to Cole and Gloria. You're going, Gloria said simply. Shadow, standing beside her, looked up. Avery smiled and nodded. I think we all are. It was 2 weeks after the trial, and a new energy pulsed through the town of Asheville. The courtroom's echo had faded, but its impact had just begun to ripple outward. On Capitol Hill in Raleigh, North Carolina lawmakers gathered in a chamber more accustomed to dry debates about road maintenance and tax allocations. But this day was different. This day, they were voting on legislation inspired not by lobbyists, but by a German shepherd who had refused to surrender his spirit. The proposed law, officially named the Canine Protection and Justice Act, included sweeping new mandates, enhanced penalties for abuse or neglect of working animals, mandatory reporting for shelters encountering animals with signs of surgical tampering, and funding for trauma-informed rehabilitation programs in municipal shelters. It was unprecedented for the state. At the heart of it all stood Shadow, his image projected on monitors across the chamber, a photo of him beside the witness stand, calm, collected, wearing his trauma response vest. Reporters clustered outside the building, pens flying, cameras snapping as the vote was cast. Avery sat in the balcony beside a representative from the State Animal Welfare Coalition, her fingers laced tightly in her lap. Her blazer was slightly wrinkled from the drive, and she had barely slept the night before. But when the board lit up green, she exhaled and smiled, quietly, as though afraid to disturb something sacred. In the days that followed, Shadow's story was picked up by national media. Morning shows ran segments titled The Dog Who Testified and From Kennel to Capitol, Shadow's Journey. A documentary team requested access to New Dawn Shelter, and educational posters featuring Shadow's image and the phrase, "Even heroes need help," were printed and distributed to schools across the state. The attention was intense but purposeful, and Shadow, grounded as ever, seemed to handle it with the same silent dignity he always had. Cole Bennett, however, found himself in unfamiliar waters. The call had come from the administrative office of the courts in Raleigh, a formal invitation to consult on a new initiative integrating animal-assisted therapy into legal proceedings involving children and trauma survivors. They wanted someone with field experience, someone who had trained a dog like Shadow, someone who had stood in the courtroom and known what it meant to be both protector and witness. Cole had never imagined himself in an office setting. He was a man built for patrol boots and quiet woods, not conference tables and PowerPoint slides. But something in him stirred. He took the meeting. The program was in its early stages, a joint effort between judicial officers, behavioral specialists, and a nonprofit called Pathways of Voice. Its director, Camille Rhodes, was a soft-spoken woman in her late 40s with pale gray eyes, a serene voice, and a distinct sense of presence. Tall and reed-thin, she wore long cardigans and always seemed to listen more than she spoke. She had lost her younger sister to domestic violence in their childhood, an experience that had shaped her life's mission, giving voice to the silent. Camille believed animals could help do that. "We've seen what Shadow can do," she told Cole during their meeting in a small corner office lined with books and framed child art. "We believe this model, court dogs who've survived trauma themselves, can bridge the gap between victims and the justice system." Cole nodded slowly. "And you want me to help build that? We want you to lead it." That night, Cole walked the length of the New Dawn Shelter grounds with Shadow at his side. The trees around the perimeter were stripped bare, the wind dry and high. He stopped at the edge of the field where the agility training course had been set up, now repurposed to gently reintroduce fury-active dogs to structured movement. Shadow sat beside him, tail brushing against Cole's boot. "You know I wasn't made for boardrooms," Cole muttered. Shadow didn't respond. He simply looked up with the calm that had steadied Cole more times than he could count. "All right," Cole sighed. "Let's teach them how to listen." Meanwhile, back at the shelter, Avery was reviewing the first pilot materials for her early warning system. Flowcharts outlining how to flag signs of surgical microchip removal, logs for tracking scent-based behavioral patterns, protocols for early forensic collection. She now worked with a small but dedicated team, including Nathan Romero and a newly hired case manager named Jada Winslow. Jada was in her early 30s, African American, with box braids always tied in a bun, and a laugh that filled the entire kennel hallway. She had worked previously at a shelter in Greensboro and had a reputation for being both relentless and kind, traits that made her a natural at coordinating cruelty investigations. "The difference now," she told Avery one afternoon as they compiled intake notes, "is we're not just reacting anymore. We're catching it early. This place used to feel like a last stop. Now it feels like a starting line." Outside, Shadow was lying under the elm tree that had become his unofficial post. A group of local school children were visiting the shelter for an education tour. As they approached his area, he stood slowly and trotted over to the fence. One of the girls, a tiny child with thick glasses and a puffy purple coat, reached out tentatively. Shadow sat, calm, allowing her to stroke the top of his head. "He's famous now," one of the teachers whispered to Avery. "No," Avery said, watching the girl's hand linger just a second longer than expected. "He's something better. He's a reminder. The world would remember Shadow for the courtroom, for the trial, for the law. But those who knew him best would remember the quiet moments, the ones without cameras. The moments he chose, again and again, to stay close, to stay gentle, to stay brave." The morning of the grand opening broke over Asheville like a gentle hymn, light mist trailing through the hills, the sun rising slow and golden over the frost-dusted fields. Along a quiet county road once lined with disused barns and half-forgotten fence lines, now stood a structure that looked like it had grown from the earth itself, wooden-beamed, glass-paneled, open to light and air. A large bronze plaque affixed near the entrance read, "Shadow's Way, Center for Recovery, Justice, and New Beginnings." Inside, the lobby buzzed with visitors, staff, and quiet anticipation. Local reporters lingered near coffee tables where informational brochures were stacked beneath framed photographs, some of Shadow in court, some of other dogs, eyes lifted with trust and healing. The building itself had been designed with purpose. Wide, open spaces to prevent panic, padded flooring to reduce noise, curved walls instead of sharp corners to ease canine anxiety. Shadow sat at the front like a sentinel, wearing a soft gray vest with a simple patch, Ambassador. He was now 6 years old, his once bright tan muzzle beginning to silver at the edges, but his posture had never been stronger. His eyes, those amber pools that had once flinched from human contact, now moved calmly from guest to guest, tail sweeping slow and steady behind him. Cole Bennett stood nearby, one hand resting on the leash but hardly needing it. He wore a black blazer over jeans, beard trimmed but rugged, his eyes calm beneath a weathered brow. As co-director of Shadow's Way, he had stepped fully into his new role. Not just handler, not just trainer, but protector of the system that once failed his partner. At his side was Dr. Avery James, now officially a licensed veterinarian. Her white coat was personalized with an embroidered line drawing of Shadow's silhouette above her name. She moved easily through the space, greeting guests, fielding questions, and occasionally crouching to reassure a nervous dog brought in for early assessment. The kindness in her hadn't changed, but there was something steadier in her now, a kind of practiced stillness that came from years of sitting beside suffering and not flinching. "Ready?" Cole asked, handing her the ribbon-cutting scissors. "As I'll ever be," she smiled. Outside, the ceremony began beneath a white tent adorned with string lights and potted winter evergreens. State officials, donors, volunteers, and members of the public sat wrapped in scarves in anticipation. Camille Rhodes from Pathways of Voice gave the opening speech, her voice measured, carrying the weight of everything this moment represented. This center, she said, is not just for animals, but for every person who has ever been told their pain was too quiet to matter. Avery followed with a brief but heartfelt address. Shadow taught us that silence doesn't mean weakness, and healing isn't always loud. Sometimes the bravest sound in the world is a bark that refuses to give up. As the crowd applauded, Shadow barked once, short, firm, and almost perfectly timed. It wasn't in the script, and yet somehow it said more than words ever could. Later, as the crowds dispersed into guided tours, Cole led a group to the rehabilitation wing. They passed rooms designed for scent training, trauma reprocessing, and forensic diagnostics. There were spaces for both dogs and handlers, areas where recovery could be done together. On the walls hung framed sketches from Avery's earlier days at the shelter. Her drawing of Milo, the shut-down puppy who Shadow had helped coax into the light, hung prominently near the intake area. Milo was there too now, older, healthier, bouncier. He had become a therapy dog in training, paired with one of the new handlers in residence. Among the new faces was Lena Cruz, a petite, sharp-featured woman in her late 20s with thick black curls tied up under a baseball cap. She was one of the center's first forensically trained vet techs, specializing in identifying signs of surgical tampering and illegal trauma-based training. She had a quiet, clipped tone and an intensity in her dark eyes that hinted at something hard-earned. Rumor around the staff was that Lena had left her job at a county shelter after exposing a hidden euthanasia quota scandal. She never spoke of it, but she never missed a detail either. In one of the behavior rooms, a new arrival, an emaciated collie mix named Jasper, lay flat against the far wall, trembling. He'd come in just the day before, rescued from an abandoned farmhouse during a hoarding case. Jasper had refused food, flinched from every approach. Shadow was let in. He didn't push. He didn't bark. He simply lay on the floor, a few feet away, and waited. Avery and Lena watched from the other side of the glass, clipboards in hand, hearts in throats. After 10 minutes, Jasper raised his head. 10 more, and he shifted forward. A paw, then a shoulder. By the half-hour mark, he was lying parallel to Shadow, eyes no longer hollow. Lena murmured, "You could build an army of trainers and still not match that." Avery smiled. "That's because he doesn't train them. He reminds them." Back outside, Cole stood under the elm tree where Shadow had once watched over the shelter yard. He looked out over the new courtyard, a blend of grass and gravel paths, shaded benches, and sensory gardens designed to engage the gentlest parts of the canine brain. Gloria Benson, now fully retired but still honorary advisor to the center, approached with a cane in hand and a warm scarf wrapped around her shoulders. Her gait was slower, her hair whiter, but her voice had lost none of its clarity. "You did it," she said. "We all did," Cole replied. "You started it." "No," she said, looking toward Shadow now dozing under the afternoon light. "He did." The center would go on. Dogs would come and go, some broken, some angry, some silent. And Shadow would be there, walking beside them, not as a hero on a pedestal, but as a survivor who stayed, who healed, who offered his silence and his bark as a bridge for others to cross. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not come in thunder or lightning, but in silence, in loyalty, in a single bark that refuses to be ignored. Shadow's story reminds us that healing is possible even after betrayal, and that love, especially the kind that comes from those who cannot speak, can be God's way of reaching the wounded places we hide. Shadow was broken, lost, forgotten, but through compassion, patience, and divine timing, he not only found his way home, he helped build a path for others. Isn't that what we all long for? To be seen, to be chosen, to be used for something greater than our pain. In every animal we rescue, every broken spirit we help mend, we reflect a little of God's grace in this world. It may not make the headlines, but it makes all the difference. So today, if you believe in second chances, If you believe that no creature is too lost to be found, if you believe that even the quietest life can change the world, comment Amen below and share this story with someone who needs hope today. Subscribe for more real stories of love, redemption, and quiet miracles. Pray with us that more dogs like Shadow and more people like Avery and Cole will continue to walk among us. May God bless every viewer, every animal in need, and every heart still healing.